Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. In the last century, dating has moved from the parlor to the public square and back indoors, often to the bedroom. Not everyone's comfortable with this trend, and some argue that dating isn't even appropriate for Christians. Today we'll talk to a contributor to a collection of essays offering different perspectives on biblically based relationships. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is author and religious historian Lauren Winner, contributor to the book 5 Paths to the Love of Your Life, Defining Your Dating Style. Lauren is a guest of the January series of Calvin College. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks.
About a decade ago, a book by Joshua Harris called I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out.
Was that a decade ago?
Crazy popular. What did you think of that book?
Well, the first thing I thought was that it wasn't a decade ago, but I guess that's true. So that book advocated the so-called courtship model of relationships, in which young Christians are asked not to date, but to court one another, to spend time largely in groups as opposed to one-on-one. There's also an element, some in Harris's work and then some in other people who've picked up the model of really involving your parents, and particularly the parents of the woman, in decisions about dating and marriage and so forth. Well, when the book first came out, and I had really just become a Christian when that happened, so actually Josh Harris's book was sort of an icon for me of the wackiness of the world I had just landed in a certain way, how different it was from the surrounding secular society. I was sort of anti-courtship for a variety of reasons. When I went back actually to reread that book when I was writing the essay for the 5 Paths to the Love of Your Life book, I found that I actually agreed with a lot more of it than I thought that I had in sort of caricature. That is that Harris is really persuasive on the idea that dating in modern America has become sort of too individualistic, and that dating or romantic relationships or friendships should proceed, at least in part, in the frame of one's larger community. So when I have single friends who are dating, I really do try to say, of course I want you to spend time one-on-one with this person, and a real courtship advocate might not say that. But I also hope that you are spending time with your larger community, because the way we get to know someone one-on-one is different from the way we get to know them when we're
Because we see them interact with people besides ourselves.
I still think that the courtship model is problematic on a couple of grounds. One ground is that I don't know of any real advocates of courtship who are also egalitarian. And as someone whose leanings are much more egalitarian, I find problematic the real pervasiveness of very rigid gender roles that seem to almost be taken for granted in the courtship literature. And I can actually imagine a courtship model that didn't have those rigid gender roles. I can imagine a kind of egalitarian courtship, but it doesn't seem to really be out there.
Courtship has, and one of the problems, and it's acknowledged in this book, one of the problems with the courtship model is there is no single courtship model, so different people are talking about different things. When I encountered the book, and it was fairly recently, it seemed so countercultural to me that I couldn't even imagine how you would find another person who wanted to be involved in the courtship model. But what's the difference between courtship and dating as you see it?
Well, and can I just say one more thing just about courtship first? I think part of the reason that it gets harder and harder to imagine courtship working is that actually it seems to be a model that's designed for teenagers and college students. And I think one of the main problems with advocating some model of courtship as the way to do Christian relationships is that as you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, whatever after college, it becomes much harder to imagine, particularly the piece of having your family be intimately involved. It just really doesn't seem to be a model that's about adults. It seems to be a model that's about much younger.
One of the authors in this book, and the collection of essays expresses 5 really quite different viewpoints, and that's kind of the point of the book. But at least one of the authors advocates the woman, to go back to the idea of not being egalitarian, the woman should live close to family, and if she's far away having a career, she should just go home and
even if she's 42.
Right. Problematic in my case. My father's deceased. I can't get his advice and move home. So as you say, courtship model seems maybe even to reinforce the idea that if you're not married by the time you're out of college, you've got
something's
a big
really
problem.
wrong.
Yeah. You suggested that the church can take the place of the nuclear family in situations like that.
Well, not only can the church, I mean, I
Must.
think Jesus calls, I mean, Jesus is not interested in the nuclear family. Jesus is interested in the church family.
True. Yeah.
So the church in contemporary America, I think, rightfully can diagnose that our surrounding society is sort of hostile to families in some ways, and it's good to try to shore up families. On the other hand, I think we run the risk of shoring up families and saying the family is really your primary source of grace. Not exactly.
Yeah, right.
I don't think that then Christians should say, great, let's just date like the way everyone else dates. And, it's important to note, sometimes you hear seminars or whatever on the biblical approach to dating. Well, there is no biblical approach to dating because dating didn't exist until the early 20th century, really. But there are biblical principles about how to have relationships with other people that I think apply and that we can translate into the dating situation. And I do think it is important, and I think this is part of the core impulse behind the courtship model. It is important for Christians to be discerning and even to critique many of the ways that dating relationships proceed in kind of contemporary America. Some people would argue that dating doesn't even really exist anymore in the secular world, that people, in fact, that there was a brief moment, basically the 20th century, where there was a real kind of established etiquette of what a dating relationship looks like.
Well, let's back up to that for just a minute. I mean, as you outlined briefly in your essay, dating is a fairly recent occurrence that comes about partly because the automobile makes it possible to leave the house. My grandmother used to tell stories that she was forbidden to date young men with automobiles.
Cars, right.
She found one with an airplane, and but that was just to frustrate her parents, I think. But that prior to that, and I thought this was really interesting, prior to that, a woman really had an awful lot of power in the relationship in that it was up to her to invite or permit a young man to come court her, to come visit her. That was within her control. Dating reverses that.
Well, and that's a very interesting point in terms of the way that some evangelical writers, back to the sort of gender role issue, say, women should not initiate in a dating relationship. Well, in the, say, late 19th century, when there was no dating yet and people called on young women, as you say, it really was up to the woman and admittedly her parents to receive or not receive someone who was coming to call on her. And the woman actually did have a lot more authority than she had in, say, 1930. So what had happened by 1930 was, as you say, the automobile made it possible for people not to just sit on the front porch, but to actually go out on a date. And what happened when people began going out was that dating became associated with spending money. So you knew you were going on a date when money was spent at a restaurant, at a movie theater, at a public park or something. And because women didn't have access to much of their own money, it became the man who was spending money on the woman, et cetera. And that really is a 20th century phenomenon.
Well, and it has seemed to me even fairly recently that it's, I talk with some friends about, there are times when you're not sure whether you're on a date or you're just having dinner together, and one of the indicators is what night of the week is it, and one of the indicators is who pays.
And that is an interesting question as well, because of course many women do now have access to their own money, and so I can remember in the 80s and 90s it being this sort of debate about, well, as a woman, should you or should you not offer to pay, insist on paying, go Dutch? As soon as women did start having their own incomes, the old rules didn't fit quite as well.
And rules, it was interesting to me to read and to recognize that all these rules are fairly arbitrary and fairly recent. When I was a young teenager, I was taught never, ever to phone a boy. The boy would phone me, and I would wait for that. And by the time I was in my early 20s, that rule seemed to have been eliminated, but maybe not for everyone, so I was never quite sure whether I was supposed to or whether I wasn't supposed to. All that kind of complication, and I think for a lot of people in their young adulthood and even older, dating is such a confusing scene. You're not sure what the rules are anymore, and at one extreme is a sort of very formal, old-fashioned, the man will call you and call on you and so forth and meet your parents first and all. And at the other extreme is this phenomenon, scary phenomenon of friends with benefits, where you don't really date, you just have sex.
Right.
It also has seemed to me that in the dating world, sex has in a lot of ways just simply been separated from love, that those are two completely different issues on the table, which tremendously complicates the idea of preparing for marriage. So back to the book now, you argue that dating should be done with the goal of marriage. But you pull back from a little bit. It's not that everyone you date you have to marry.
Right, I would qualify that immediately.
Yeah.
And I think talking about that goal of marriage is really complicated in contemporary Christian contexts, because on the one hand, I think the secular model of dating is that dating, insofar as there is dating, really has very little to do with an expectation of marriage. And then on the other hand, if you plunk down in certain Christian communities, Christian colleges, et cetera, where there's the sort of ring by spring pressure, and the sense that if you go on 4 dates with someone and you don't marry them, then you failed in some way. Somehow there has to be something in between those two extremes. So I am made uncomfortable by the secular notion that we simply date to have fun or to learn more about ourselves. Though I do think that one does gain self-knowledge through dating. That is a fruit of dating.
Sure.
But it would seem to me, in a Christian context, that if it became really clear in the course of a dating relationship that you were not going to marry this person, that probably means you ought to stop being involved in a romantic relationship with them.
So dating really is about getting to know the person, and you're kind of ascertaining character and relationship with the idea that the ultimate relationship, the ultimate human relationship, might be marriage.
Well, I'm not sure I would say that's the ultimate human relationship.
Yeah, well, sure.
But that, now, and again, I can immediately think of exceptions. If, for example, you're talking about two people in their 80s who live in a retirement community together, might that pair of people develop a special relationship? They're not interested in remarrying. Sure. I mean, I think that we can think of contexts.
Well, the AARP did a survey recently in which they ascertained that something like 70% of unmarried people in their AARP age, which is 50 and up, 14% of the women and 22% of the men were actually looking for a mate. Everyone else simply wanted companionship, fun, whatever.
Well, as my husband's grandmother says about her now dead husband, and whether she wants to marry again, why pick a Ford when you'd had a Rolls Royce?
Sure. Yeah.
But absolutely, one can imagine in that circumstance that having a relationship of some kind of special companionability later in life makes a whole lot of sense. But I think when you're talking about people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you might be in a different scenario.
Right. Yeah. Which varies from person to person.
Sure. And I think part of the difficulty in the Christian community of diagnosing the relationship between dating and marriage is that we do such a bad job of talking about singleness that it becomes then very difficult to talk about marriage well, and vice versa.
I agree.
So if the reason that we have this problem in the Christian community of assuming that if you go on 4 dates with someone and you don't marry them, then you've failed, is that we're all sort of walking around with the notion that really the best state is marriage. So I think there's actually a prior conversation that needs to happen, and not just conversation, but a prior arrangement of life in the Christian community that says, no, actually singleness is not some second best option. It's not a temporary state. You're just waiting until God does something in your life, but that singleness is a vital part of God's economy, and it's vital for the church. And I think if we appreciated that in a genuine way, we would be able to have a somewhat freer conversation about dating and
and
marriage.
as you argue, what we need to get at is how do we learn to love one another better in every context and in every kind of relationship, so that as you argue, our primary goal should not be to find a man or find a woman, but to learn to love better, so that our reflections, our human relationships, can be reflections of our relationships with God. Right?
Well, and I think that actually raises a question about an interesting way that evangelicals in the contemporary scene talk about marriage, which is, on the one hand, obviously in a marriage you're talking about a particular relationship that has a particular kind of love and that is directed towards this one other person. On the other hand, if we hold that up as sort of the highest and only good, and if we, for example, the idea that singleness is good because you can serve a lot more when you're single because you don't have any responsibilities, implies, I think very problematically, that when you get married, you're just supposed to
focus on your
gaze
spouse.
into the eyes of your spouse and then possibly your children. In fact, I think all Christian households, whether they're married or not, are called to be much more permeable than that and much more other-directed. And it's a kind of worrying sort of Victorian notion of what domesticity is, that Christian marriage is about totally focusing on this one other person.
And it seems to me that there are different ways to do it, that a married couple ought to be enabling one another to serve better together.
Right.
What about technology? You bring this into the picture, and everyone acknowledges it, that the kinds of technology we have today have altered the way we develop relationships. They've altered the dating scene. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think technology has, recent technological developments have really changed everything, and one can even see that when thinking about high schoolers. In fact, we may see it the most when thinking about high schoolers, that even 10 years ago, a high school dating relationship would have been known about by a person's parents. And simply this issue of calling. I mean, before there were cell phones, if you wanted to call your high school friend, the parents of the friend would hear the phone ring.
Right.
So the sense that now even a phone conversation is taken out of the purview of a parental relationship in the household. And then I think we even see the effects of technology on friendships. I mean, this sort of I-emming effect of like you're in a college dorm and you're I-emming the person
who's
next
20
door,
feet away.
right?
Yeah.
Now that said, I actually think there is some possibility that some of the online dating things are potentially pointing to and perhaps even filling a kind of need, and that is sort of the need of the village matchmaker. That 100 years ago there would have been a community who was sort of invested in getting people matched up or what have you. And in the absence of that, instead we have Match.com. Now, those aren't identical, but it speaks to the fact that we do have this need that it is quite hard to find someone to date and to make that relationship work. So potentially the technology is not all bad, but I don't even own a television, so I'm of course going to say.
You've always maintained in your book Real Sex too that marriage is a communal thing, that all our relationships happen within the context of the church and of a larger community, so that I think, am I wrong in saying that you would suggest that privacy really is not appropriate until a relationship is fairly serious? Or am I misreading that?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that privacy should be balanced with a kind of community involvement. Because I mean, I don't think you only get to know someone in a kind of community context, but I also think you don't only get to know someone if you are simply alone with them, particularly when you're simply alone with them in the throes of infatuation. You really will only be seeing one piece of that person. And I think it's really tempting. I mean, the logic of infatuation is that you want to spend all of your time with this person.
Right.
And I don't even, that I'm not euphemistically speaking about sex here. Just you just want to be with them all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it is important to have some element of one-on-one, but I think it's also important to see one another with other people.
You make an interesting comment in the essay about infatuation that Diogenes Allen says that infatuation is a glimpse into what it would. When you're infatuated, you tend to sort of be in love with everything. You get into that mood that everything pleases you, and you suggest that that might be a quick look at what it might be like to really love our neighbors all the time.
Yeah, and this is Diogenes Allen's book on love is, I think, still sadly out of print, and if there are any publishers watching, someone should bring it back into print. It's a great book. And he says that kind of falling in love feeling, not only does it make everything seem beautiful and lovely, we really want to serve the object of our love when we're, and I think that is absolutely, like I definitely wanted to serve my husband more when I just met him and we were sort of falling in love than I do now. Now it's this sort of power struggle and he's left his hair in my shower. You know,
Yes, right.
And I think Alan is quite insightful to say that feeling of it just gives me pleasure to be of service is part of what we are getting at in the call to love neighbor. Now I would say that might usefully be balanced with, you know, if that's kind of a model of love of neighbor from the one-on-one intense relationship, I think we learned something else from looking at monastic communities and love of neighbor. I've recently read two different books about convents, one a novel and one a memoir, and they both articulate that in that monastic call to celibacy and in that renunciation, not just of sex, but of particular friendships, that the monastic is freeing herself to love all equally, and that is sort of the other piece of the love of neighbor, that it would be that intense love and desire to serve everyone. And I was very captivated
really
by that monastic notion.
Right. That's a really positive turn on that. I know Kathleen Norris has written about the celibacy sort of being a constant challenge,
right.
Not to sort of suppress your feelings or deny them or make them go away, but to learn the discipline of overcoming them. But this is an interesting take on
that it is a call to love everyone and not to
kind
just
of a
love
redistribution
one.
of your affections.
Right, democratic love.
Dating, especially young dating, it seemed to me that there's a real selfishness often. I mean, I think that's natural. That starting with childhood, you want to please yourself most, and I think young teenagers particularly sort of get crushes on people who they feel good being with. There was a poster back in the 70s. It was I love you not only for what you are, but for what I am when I am with you. And the rest of, as I remember it, the rest of it is really about you make me feel good about myself. And I've heard that expressed so many times, and in some ways it's a really neat thing, and in others it reinforces the selfishness that already is celebrated in our culture. You call infatuation deformed love at one point, that it's more about acquiring than giving. How do you get past that, and how might that connect to dating? That is there a point at which you might be just too young to date, or need to reorient what you think dating is?
Well, and I do think if we want to think about what Christian dating might look like as opposed to sort of secular American sect in the city dating, one piece of that is, what do we mean by love? And do any of us understand what agape is? Right. And what is the relationship between agape and eros? And that the danger, and it is, I think, a particular danger for our culture, the danger is that I love you and that means I want to consume you. And that when I say I love you, what I really mean is I love myself.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a call really for the churches, and this is way prior to dating, to really talk about and practice sort of cruciform love in every relationship. And I think, back to sort of teenagers, one question is, do we therefore actually need to think about parenting differently? I mean, have we also sort of articulated a slightly deformed notion of what parental and particularly maternal love looks like? And if we articulate sort of other notions of cruciform love in other relationships, would that form us to be able to have that kind of love at the center of a dating relationship?
So you really seem to be suggesting then that maybe if children are brought up differently, they can begin to think about relationships differently. Is that
sure?
Where we're going? Okay. I don't think you can stop kids from having crushes or wanting to be involved. I had a boyfriend in the 2nd grade. It was quite serious, I think, maybe. It meant that we played at recess together.
Yeah.
But it's never seemed to me very successful to try to say forbid someone. You could forbid kids from going out on dates. You can't really, especially in this day and age, forbid them from having any contact. Are there ways that we can help young people have healthier relationships? And if so, where do we go with that?
Well, and in particular, high schoolers, I think this does, again, raise questions about sort of family culture and the culture of parenting. Because here, unlike when someone's in their 20s or 30s, like here, obviously the parents do need to be involved. And if you're not involved in your kid's life in a sort of good, open, and time-consuming way before they're dating, it would be hard then to say, oh, suddenly you're dating and I want to be involved in this relationship. So I think actually the culture of kind of quality time versus quantity time parenting is somewhat problematic, and particularly, it's very easy for me to talk about parenting because I don't have kids. But friends of mine with teenagers do say, you can't parent a teenager on your own terms. The teenager's going to come home at 11 o'clock at night, and that's when they want to talk to you, if they want to talk to you at all. And you may want to be asleep, but you have a choice. Do you want to talk to your kid, or do you want to be asleep? So I do think that parenting of teenagers really involves, in a certain way, a different kind of self-sacrifice.
My guest today has been author and religious historian Lauren Winner, contributor to the book 5 Paths to the Love of Your Life, Defining Your Dating Style. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.